Hey, this is Scott Townsend. Welcome back to the Scott Townsend Show. And today I have with me recurring guest for the third time in as many years, Erik Rostad. Erik, how's it going?
It's great. How you doing?
Great, good. Yeah, it's a tradition here at the Scott Townsend Show to have Erik come in on December's, and he's got an interesting project. You, if you've listened before, you know he's got a reading project that he does year to year. And in December, we get together and talk about what he's read, what he's learned, what he's done, what's good, what's bad, just kind of giving us a year in review of his reading project. So, yeah, I'm going to turn it back over to you. But before I do that, what I always ask everybody is, what did you have for breakfast this morning?
I had a pretty big breakfast, so I always start with coffee, and then I had 3 eggs, and then I had a sandwich with peanut butter and honey. That's my favorite.
Hmm.
Put a little bananas in there as well. And then
Yeah.
my daughter's favorite thing right now is cinnamon rolls. So my wife made those, and so I usually don't have that much, but I had a cinnamon roll to top it all off. So
Ooh, man.
and an
That is,
orange because my colleague at the bookstore just got us all oranges, and so I had an orange as well.
yeah, that's great. So, fill us in 2024. You're, from year to year, you do different reading projects, and it seems like this one spilled over from the year before, maybe. I'll kind of let you go into give us what was your plan for 2024 and how did it go?
Yeah. Well, yeah, in thinking back that we this is our third time talking. The first time we talked would have been right at the point where I was making a shift in my reading project. So I started it in 2017 as a way to read more books, but also to put in some experiments to better remember what I was reading. So I didn't just want to read a bunch of books and then forget them all. So the first 6 years of the project, so 2017 through 2022, I would just make different lists of 52 books and then attempt to get through all those in a year. And between 2022 and 2023, I decided to start reading the great books. And so for anyone who's not aware of the great books, there's a bunch of different lists out there that are just the books that have stood the test of time and the books that have kind of informed all the other books. And so there's
I
different
was going to
lists.
say,
And so,
how do you define a great book? I think like I think Stuart Little's a good great book, but doesn't necessarily fall
yeah,
into.
yeah. So let me get into that in just a minute.
Yeah.
So I went, I looked at all these different lists, and then I made a list of like roughly 200 of the ones that I wanted to read. And instead of it being 200 great books, it's more 200 great authors. Just because I don't want to just read one book by Shakespeare. I want to read a bunch of his plays. I don't want to just read one thing from Plato. I want to read a bunch of them. And so it'll end up being more kind of like 200 authors. And um yeah, at first I didn't really know back to your question, I didn't really know what a great book meant other than that it just was really good and had an impact. But what I've started to see is that the great books talk to each other. And so for instance, I started reading Homer last year, and I started with the Iliad, and then I read the Odyssey. And then in this year, 2024, I got into the Greek tragedies. And what happens in a lot of these Greek tragedies is that they are commenting on or referencing things that happen in Homer. So
Hmm.
there's this direct connection where they're kind of riffing on what Homer has introduced. And then this up next year, 2025, is when I'll start getting into the philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. And for what I understand of them is that they're also taking ideas from Homer, and they're talking about them more in a philosophical manner. And in
Hmm.
the tragedies, you're kind of dealing with the ideas that have been brought up in Homer in a tragic situation, but one where it's kind of like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And so it just puts you in this impossible situation, but looking at whether issues of morality, questions, deep questions like what should you do in a given circumstance, But with these tragedies, it's just like these impossible circumstances. So you really get kind of a working out of what does this look like? What does it mean? What does it mean to say this or to have this ideal? But then what does that look like in real life?
Hmm.
So yeah, the great books. So then, going further on, Saint Augustine writes Confessions, but writes it in the structure of the Odyssey.
Hmm.
Nietzsche writes a book about tragedies. He's referring to the Greek tragedies. And so that's kind of this connection point with the great books, is that they're speaking to one another. They're talking about things that maybe Homer brought up and another author kind of added something to those ideas. So I'll see as I go along if there's kind of these individual books along the way that just stand alone without referencing. But I have a feeling that a lot of the books on these lists are going to be ones that are referencing one another.
So you went back. How far back do you go? Did you go regarding the great books? I know you do the Bible once a year at the beginning of the year.
Mhm.
Uh, how far back did you go with these?
Yeah, so when I made my initial list, I think it was around 1800 BC, which would be the Epic of Gilgamesh. I think it's around that time frame. And then I started reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, and one of the translations I used was by a guy named Sophus Hell. And he as I was reading Gilgamesh, he came out with a translation of an even older work by a female author from 2300 BC, and her name is Enheduanna. And she lived in the city of Ur, which is where Abram was called out of in the Bible. But she was a priestess, and she went around and wrote about the different gods and the different temples in the city of Ur. And it's really interesting. And so that kind of became the new oldest book. We just found the tablets that her poetry was written on in within the last 50 years, or last 50 or 100 years. So it's relatively new where we found these tablets, and then they were translated, and then this is the first complete works released by her, and it was just released last year. So the oldest one now is 2300 BC, which puts that roughly 1500 years before Homer. So a lot of the great books lists will start with Homer, and rightly so in the sense of just the impact that Homer has had. I like to go back a little further with works from Egypt, Gilgamesh, and then this in Hedawara as well.
Right. In the 2024 reading project, are there any books in this list that surprised you? Any that you thought were like, wow, that was like really awesome, or that wasn't quite as great as I thought it was going to be? Was there any
Yeah,
surprises?
I'll do one of each. One surprise, and then one not as good as I thought it would be. So let me just preface the good one. So I read the Iliad last year for the first time in my life,
Mm-hmm.
and but I wanted to read the Iliad and the Odyssey twice just to make sure I got the story down and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And so my second reading of the Iliad occurred in March of this past year, and I just love it. I ended up reading it one more time, and I led a reading group on it later this year. So I think just overall, the Iliad is it's my new favorite book. I just anytime I would pick it up, whether it was I only had a few minutes to read or like an hour to read, I would just get something like this is incredible. Even just like one page would just be astonishing. And so I love the Iliad. I think the thing so partly the Iliad in terms of what surprised me, but secondly, after the Iliad, I read this book called Greek Epic Fragments, and what it did was go into fragments of works that we no longer we don't have the full work. And what was contained in that book was something called the Epic Trojan Cycle, and that was made up of 8 works. And the Iliad and the Odyssey are 2 of the 8 works, but they're
Hmm.
works number 2 and 7. And so there is a work before the Iliad, not necessarily written by Homer. And in fact, they probably weren't written by Homer, but there was this group of 8 works that the Greeks would have known. They would have known all the stories in these. We only have 2 of them. Um, but that just fascinated me. Like we're missing six of these works. We kind of have a rough idea what was in each of those because someone in the
Hmm.
ancient time did a review of, or kind of a summary of each of the works. So we know what's inside, and we know some of the myths and all that and the stories from other works. But I had no idea that that these that the Iliad and the Odyssey were part of this this grand work of like eight works together that made up the epic Trojan cycle. And just coming
Wow.
across that was really interesting to me. So that on the good side, that was a big surprise. On the hard side, I'll say that not like it's not a bad book because it's one of the great books, but just one that
Right.
I had trouble with personally was Pindar's Odes. And this is written after the time of Homer, but this Pindar, who's the author, wrote these kind of odes or songs or almost like praises of different Greek athletes, and
Mm.
then he tied in a lot of mythology. But the way I describe it is you almost need like a master's degree level of understanding of Greek mythology to understand what he's talking about because it just goes so deep. And I'm maybe at like the elementary school level of
Right.
understanding Greek mythology. So it just so much of it was over my head. I'm glad I read it and there's some neat stories in there, but that was one I just had a lot of trouble with reading this year.
When you are you redoing this for pleasure, or are you doing this to learn? Is there a balance there? Is this like you sit back and you just enjoy reading about the, Iliad and Homer and the Odyssey? Or is this a way to grow, develop, learn? Is it either one or both, or what's the balance there?
Yeah, I think probably at first it was more I didn't want to die not having read these works. Just
Mm.
they're they're great work. Like in over the last 20 years, I've been buying these books with the hope that I would someday read them, but I never really had a plan to read them. It was just more of like a hope. And maybe some of that comes from having read a couple books like 20 years ago that would be considered great books and just reading them and thinking these are incredible. Like these are amazing. So now that I've made a plan to actually get through them. At first, it may have been kind of more of a I want to read them, just get through them. But the more I'm reading them now, I would consider 2024 my best year of reading in the sense of it being the most enjoyable year of
Mm.
reading. And I would
Wow.
say 2023 was that before I got to 2024. I read a lot of the Greek tragedies this year, and they're I each one I would go to, each different tragedy I would go to, I was like, this is just incredible. And so the enjoyment levels of reading were just off the charts. I mean, it truly was the most enjoyable year of reading I've ever had. And so yeah, maybe it started out the one way, but like it is becoming so enjoyable. Like I love reading when I reread the Iliad, I loved that. When I led the reading group on the Iliad, it was just fascinating to hear uh, people's views on the Iliad, and
Mhm.
a lot of them it was their first time reading it, so just kind of hearing first ideas of what they're coming across and all that. So yeah, it's become like it's just an absolute pleasure and joy of reading these works.
Yeah, I hear the phrase it read like a Greek tragedy.
Hmm.
The Greek tragedy, I guess that just must be the worst that can ever happen. Is a Greek tragedy that bad? I mean,
Yeah, it's in some of them the levels of suffering of the main characters are off the charts, but yeah. But that phrase, what you say, like reads like a Greek tragedy, maybe in just how bad it is, I guess, or like in the sense like how bad it is for the people
mhm.
involved in the story. Um, but the stories themselves are fascinating, and they're relatively short. I mean, you can read through one in 2 to 3 hours, uh, but they reference so many different parts of the Greek mythology, or they reference different parts of Homer, to where it's just fun to see how they do it. And the audience surely would have known what was going to happen in each of these stories. And a lot of the times we know what has happened just from other Greek works or just movies we've seen or all that. So
Hmm.
part of it is it's like going to watch Titanic. Like we know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's kind of up to the movie producer in that case to make it interesting and to
Draw
tell
us
different
in.
stories going on the way. So that's kind of a lot of what's happening in the Greek tragedies. Like the audience would have known what was going to happen.
If you had to pick one book from your 2024 list that really changed your perspective or had a big impact, which one would it be and why?
Ooh, probably. I mean the Iliad, but that was kind of a reread. Um, let me go with the first tragedy I read, and that
Okay.
was Aeschylus. So there's three tragedy writers. There's four that are considered the greatest of all time, and three of them were Greek, and they lived at the same exact time, which is just
Well,
insane to think about. And they're performing these plays in Athens on the hill right by the Acropolis, and they're competing against each other. Like they would have a yearly contest where they're competing, and so like that was just incredible. But the shift for me from going from Homer to the tragedies was a difficult one, and I had to read the first tragedy four times to get it. And so that's Aeschylus, and that's the Orestia. And again, each tragedy play is 2 to 3 hours, but it's a trilogy, and so there's three parts to that. And I just had to sit there and read each one four times. And I don't know if it was just the switch from Homer's epic poetry to Greek tragedy, but it just took me. And I also had like a really hard job I was working on at the time, so anytime I would go down to like start reading, my mind would wander pretty quickly. So, but anyway, I had to I'm it was frustrating, but I'm glad I spent that time and read each one four times because I think it really helped me in the other tragedy plays. Like it's like my mind got reworked into being able to kind of understand what was going on in these tragedies and how to read them and how to think about them. So uh that was probably the biggest shift for me just in thinking because I've got a huge list that I want to read. So spending time reading each one four times is it can get frustrating or like I need to keep moving on, but on the other hand I'm really glad I took the time to do that.
so many people will read. So many people don't read books, and those who do read books do good to get through it one time,
Hmm.
much less four times. So
Yeah.
that's pretty amazing. Uh, I actually have started enjoying reading books twice,
Mm.
and because I get more out of it the second time than I did the first time.
Yeah.
First time I'll just read through it like I'm watching a TV show or a movie and just go through it, and then I'll go back and uh, try to understand what was going on, who's doing what and why. So it's pretty important. I
On
mean,
that, let me
interesting.
make one comment.
Yeah.
So I divide my reading my each year's reading into five different segments you could call. And so the first one is January and February. I read straight through a different version of the Bible. March through June is great books, and I just go right from I'm reading them in chronological order. So I just go wherever I left off last, and then just start. July is summer break, and so that's where I'm reading more like newer books or just books that people have said, "Hey, you got to read this." It's not on the great books list or whatever, but so most of those are books that have been written in the last 5-10 years. Then I go back into the great books and call it fall semester. That's August through November, and then December I'm back in a break month. So I call that winter break. So right now I'm in my winter break,
Hmm.
and I had a publisher here in the city where I live. We got together for lunch, and she gave me a book, and it's called Theo of Golden by Alan Levi. And she gave me that book, and she said you need to read this as soon as you can. And so it was my first book that I read in December. But you just mentioned, you're enjoying rereading books. When she gave me that book, she said I read this 5 times in a row. And this is a publisher. This was not for her work either. Like this
Yeah,
is a publisher who is getting constant books to read from
sure.
clients and stuff. And so this was just for fun. And she told me what each one was. So the first time she read it, she just loved it, so she wanted to read it right away again. But the first time was for the plot, like just to understand what happened. Second time, she was really paying attention to the characters. The next time, the third time, she was looking at wordsmithing. So just how were the words used? Like how did this particular author put sentences together and all that? And that's just kind of fascinating for her. The fourth time, she was looking for Easter eggs.
Mm,
So kind
mm.
of, you know,
That's cool.
is he referencing what's going to happen later on? And then the fifth
Right.
time, um, I think she just wanted to read it again just for the pleasure of it. But I thought that was so interesting, and it got me intrigued that somebody would read a book five times in a row like that. I mean, I've never heard of anybody doing that. You know, for
What's the name of the book?
Theo of Golden by Alan Levi, and it really was good. It was a excellent book.
I've watched now for movies. I've watched Up, the movie
Yeah,
Up,
yeah.
31 times. I've counted.
Wow, wow. That's
And I'm still
incredible.
going. So I want to get to 50. I've got this far, you know. But
Yeah.
every time I will watch it, just like reading a book, I notice something, I get something, I see a little like in one episode or in the episode in the portion of the movie when he and the Ellie are up are in her old house and he lets go of
Hmm.
the balloon. Well, when she grabs his hand to walk him up to get the balloon, you can just ever so slightly see his face blush, which I
Huh.
never noticed, you know. But you see this little slight little tinge of red. So they pay attention to there's
Wow.
so many little Easter eggs,
Gosh.
so many little details that I just think are fascinating. So yeah, I'm gonna
That's
check
cool.
this out. I'm kind of jazzed about it. Theo of
Yeah.
Golden.
Yeah. And another interesting idea kind of on that is we had an event at the bookstore where I'm the business manager. We had an event about the author George MacDonald, who it was his I guess 200th anniversary of his birth this year. And so the person we had in was discussing George MacDonald and in one of his books in particular. And she talked about it's called Fantastes, and it's a work of fantasy. George MacDonald's called the father of fantasy,
Hmm.
and he's impacted people from Neil Gaiman to C.S. Lewis to Susanna Clarke, just a ton of authors. And he's got this book Fantastes that a lot of people have trouble with. I've read it. I've only read it once, and I didn't know what to do with it. It's just way over my head. And
Yeah.
what she said is that book was written at a time where it would have been read out loud amongst a family and perhaps amongst friends as well. So it would have been read in a group, and it would not have been read one time. It would have been read multiple times. So it was written in a way as to like expand every time you read it. Like
Hmm.
you couldn't just read that book once and be like, okay, I've read it. It's like you had to read it multiple times, and it's one of those books that's referencing stuff, you know, hundreds of books within it, and so every time you read it, you could get a lot more. But then not only that, you would be amongst other people and you would be discussing the book. And so you just think about that compared to how we read books now
Mm-hmm.
individually, probably just once, if that, but
Right.
how these books, like you can't just read some books once. Like they're meant to be read multiple times. They're probably even meant to be read within a group, or like even, you know, Homer would have been performed. That was
Mm-hmm.
poetry that would have been sung over many days. Like it would take multiple days to perform that entire thing.
I think the Bible
So
might be one of those books where
yeah,
every
yeah,
time you read it, something else comes up.
yeah, yeah, and also just the fact that that was I mean, you know, there's letters in there that those letters would have been read out loud to a group of people. There
Mm-hmm.
would have been the person that delivered the letter would have also added commentary and answered questions. And so, yeah, the book is the end item for us in a lot of ways, but that's not how books were, or letters, or whatever. That's not how things
Right.
were for a lot of history. And we just have so many distractions now that it's easy to not read a book again, or not even really pay attention deeply when we are reading.
Hmm. You read so many books each year. How do you retain what you read? What's how do you do that?
Well, I forget a lot. So, I mean, uh, but I've experimented a lot just on the things that work for me. And so when I'm reading a book, I'm underlining
I
and
like to do that.
starring,
Hmm.
and I've got like a system. So if it's got a star on the side, that's something important I want to remember.
Hmm.
If I underline it, that's important. I also write notes in the back of the book like this. So these
Hmm.
are kind of the most important things that I want to remember from that book. So then after I'm done, it's on my bookshelf. I can take any book off my shelf and just open up to that back page in 5 minutes, read kind of the main things that I want to remember.
Hmm.
Um, so
What do you
that's
put in those
just on the
notes? What do you put in
what's that?
those notes?
Um,
Show that note again. Show that last page. So on the left, there's like, what is that? A black box or?
oh, that's this thing that's like a UPC code for the book itself.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, that's just part of the book. But
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
the writing, like I'll put a star next to something that's really important, but or just kind of a note of like what is on that page,
Okay.
just more of like, hey, look at this page for this author discussing this.
Okay.
So then I know where to look for particular things. So that's
Hmm.
kind of the first stage with the actual book itself. Then I transfer a lot of those notes into this notebook, which is I call it my everything notebook, and I get one of these a year. And then I put a lot of the book notes in here. The
Is that a
final thing I
moleskin?
do is I record a podcast episode about
Hmm.
each of the books. And that is the thing. I mean, I can tell the books that I have not podcasted on, those are the books that I have trouble remembering. If I
Hmm.
podcasted on a book, I have consolidated however many hours of reading into a 30-minute episode. So these are kind of the main things from the book. But my main the thing I think is most important for remembering what you read is just to try to remember one thing from each book.
Oh,
If you can implement it, so if it's like a finance book, just implement one idea from the book, whether that's a certain investment you make or a way of thinking about money. If it's a productivity book, just try to implement one thing. So if you actually make a change in your life from the book, you will obviously remember that because you've made a change. If it's a
hmm.
novel, I'm trying to remember the thing that I'm thinking about 2 or 3 days later as I'm driving in my car. Like
Hmm.
maybe it's an idea that stuck out to me. Maybe it's something that bothered me. Maybe it's something that was a new idea I'd never thought of. And so at the end of each of my podcast episodes, I will share the one thing from that book, the one thing that I hope to remember from that book. And it's not a perfect system. I can't just look at my bookshelves and tell you the one thing from every book, but it certainly does help. And I
Hmm.
found if I tried to remember 5 things from a book, I would not remember a single one of them. But if I just try to remember one thing, I a lot of times I could recall that one thing, and then that would actually help me to remember other things in the book as
Hmm.
well.
That's a good tip. Yeah. Remember one thing. I got to start doing that. If someone listening was looking for a great read from your 2024 list, which book would you recommend and what makes it a must read?
I after reading the Iliad, I kind of jokingly created this club called the Read the Iliad Before You Die Club. And, just try to get everyone I could to join it, to the point of starting a reading group in my local area here. And I think if you read the Iliad, it just opens up so much more because so much of what we read references the Iliad. We
Mm,
have so many cultural references to the Iliad that we don't even know are cultural references.
mm,
Words like hectoring come from the Iliad. Achilles is in the Iliad. Just all these different a lot of the Trojan War takes place in the Iliad. So just so many things that we reference a lot, so many things that then show up in other books kind of start in the Iliad. So
Hmm.
that's such an important place to start. It it is time consuming. It is difficult. I would recommend trying to read it with a group of people to discuss it. There's some incredible podcasts and some that even came out this year that
Hmm.
go book by book and just kind of help you walk through the Iliad yourself. So that would be a great place to start where you read a book and then listen to the podcast episode about that book. Just kind of reinforces what you just read, kind of
Right.
pulls out some things that are important in what you just read, and and then just kind of work your way through the Iliad. I know it's a long book, but once you read the Iliad, then you can pretty much go in to any of the Greek tragedies and just have a firmer grasp on what is happening. So it just kind of opens up, and I'm really like my biggest heart with the Iliad is to get high schoolers to read it because I think if even if you taught a class on the Iliad at a high school and only like one or two kids got it and like oh, I love this, like that would transform their lives
Hmm.
and it would open up so much of literature because it just so much points back to the Iliad or the Odyssey. And so it's not a 5 hour read type thing, but like it would be a challenging book. But if you haven't read it, try to make it a point in 2025 to read the Iliad. And there's so many good helpful tools out there to help you get through
All right. I'm sold. I guess I'll read the Iliad.
it.
You can made one convert here.
Yeah,
Uh,
good, good.
oh, also, I wanted to, this just came in today.
Oh, good,
And
good.
yeah, so thanks for the Brad Thor book. I really appreciate that. You wrote a little autograph in there, a little note. A true
Good.
patriot, keep reading. Yeah, Brad Thor's really great, and I really appreciate that. I'm
Yeah,
really jealous that you get to meet him and talk with him and stuff. That's really cool. A
yeah,
great side benefit for you there.
yeah, yeah. That's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, if someone wants to get more information about you, your reading, what's your podcast?
Yeah, it's called Books of Titans. And then I actually moved my podcast over to Substack this year.
Hmm.
And so Substack that allows me to if people get value out of the podcast, they can give money to it. So that's one side of it. The other thing I'm doing is in 2025, I'm going to start a reading group, both in person and online, where we just meet once a month. And the theme is short, great books.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to pick books that you can read between 2 and 5 hours. So, nothing like the Iliad. The Iliad actually became quite cumbersome to lead a group about because I would have to read it and then, prepare and then we'd have the discussion. And we did it for 9 weeks in a row. And
Oh
so
man.
it with my other reading and work and family and all, it got to be too much. So I thought I
Yeah.
want to keep doing something of a reading group, but not that much. So now it's just once a month. So if you live near Franklin, Tennessee, we're going to meet the second Mondays of each month. But then I'm also doing an online version, which will be on Wednesdays, the Wednesday after that second Monday of each month. And it'll be like the first book is the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Hmm.
The second book will be narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. I've got some Greek tragedies in there. I've got A Christmas Carol for December by Charles Dickens,
Hmm.
Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway. So yeah, just like great books, but ones that we can read quickly and then have a good discussion. So if you are a paid subscriber on my Substack, that gets you into that online discussion
Oh,
piece.
okay.
And I've got plans that are just $5 a month. So for $5 a month, you could join, and you don't have to do all 12 months. You could just kind of pick and choose the books that you want to
Yeah.
read and discuss. But yeah, I'm just trying to introduce people to the great books, to just show that they're approachable. They're not like these thing. I don't have a college degree of learning how to read literature. That's not what I studied in college. These books, they're not meant to confuse us and make things hard. Like they're meant to teach. They're meant to be approachable. And so I hope I can get that across to where it just opens up people to realize that there's some incredible things in these classics and these great books. So
Hmm.
that's probably the best way on that Substack, and that's just booksoftitans.com. If you're interested in the reading lists that I've had, the great books list that I'm going through, I have that all at books.booksoftitans.com. And so it's just
Oh,
kind of
okay.
two websites. The one is booksoftitans.com and the other is books.booksoftitans.com. And then I'm also on Twitter and Instagram as well at Books of Titans.
Right. The what was your major?
I did international business. So I studied at the undergraduate level, and then I worked in international business for a while, and then got a graduate degree in international business. And while I was in grad school, I had a teacher who taught us entrepreneurship, but like the basics of a lot of things so that we could kind of bootstrap a business. And one of the things he taught us was website development.
Mm,
And I just took on to it. I loved it. And so I kind of mixed that with my business background and have been doing websites for different clients for 16 years now.
wow, that's cool. Well, Eric, let's do this again next year.
Yeah.
We'll
Yeah.
go
It'd be
for number
great.
4.
Yeah.
Well, good luck with your podcast. Good luck with your reading, and anything to look forward to in 2025 regarding your books. Anything you're looking forward to? I know probably all the books you're looking forward to, but any one more than the other?
Yeah, I am. I'll be finishing the Greek tragedies, and I ended up reading. I ended up deciding to read every single one of them. So
Hmm.
Aeschylus has 7, Sophocles has 7 as well, and then Euripides has 19. And so I'm going to leave one unread by Euripides because I can't bear the thought of having read all the tragedies. So I'm going to leave one unread, but I'll close that out in my reading next year, and then I'll get into the comedies. Aristophanes is a Greek comedy writer, and then a few works of history, and then into the philosophy. So I've always been intimidated by philosophy, so I'm a little nervous about that, I guess. But
Mhm.
I think with the background now of having read Homer and the tragedies and that kind of thing, I may have a little more understanding of what is going on. So
Yeah.
that's the hope at least. But yeah, the final tragedy plays are the ones I'm looking forward to the most, just because I've enjoyed them so much this year.
It's awesome. Well, once again, thanks for the book. Really appreciate it. Brad Thor is my favorite. I'll read this again. And yeah, what's your book? Where do you work? What's the bookstore's name?
Landmark Booksellers in Franklin, Tennessee.
Franklin, Tennessee. All right. So if you're in Franklin, Tennessee, stop by, see Eric, and buy a book.
Yep. Yeah, we're about 20 minutes south of Nashville, so not too far away.
Yeah. All right, Eric. Well, thanks for stopping by and visiting with us again, and look forward to having you again in about a year.
Yeah, sounds good. Good to see
All
you,
right.
Scott.
Good to see you too. So, for Erik Rostad, this is Scott Townsend. Thanks for watching and listening to the Scott Townsend Show. Have a great day. Everything's going to be all right. And we'll talk to you later.